All right, so thank you all for joining us today for this Armor lecture. Before we bring up today's speaker, I wanted to acknowledge that the Field Museum was built within the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, as well as the Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, Meskwaki, Sauk, Illini Confederacy, Menominee, Kickapoo, Iowas, Otway, Missouri, and Miami nations. Chicago was and continues to be an important place of trade, worship, and interaction for many diverse peoples. We must remember that this land was and remains Native land. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lisa Lucero. Dr. Lucero is a professor of anthropology and medieval studies, as well as an affiliate of the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research centers on land use and settlement patterns of ancient Maya peoples of Central America. After earning her PhD from UCLA, Dr. Lucero developed and continues to run the Valley of Peace Archaeology Project, which has served as an archaeology research program and field school in Belize for over 2 decades. Throughout her research on Maya landscapes, Dr. Lucero has witnessed the dramatic alterations of the modern Belizean landscape as a result of climate change and agricultural and industrial practices. And she discusses these observations in her upcoming book, which will be out next year. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about her observations and work. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Lucero.
Thank you for coming this afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. I appreciate the Field Museum welcoming me to share my research. And this is a next stage of my research of applied anthropology. I've done that before, but this is taking it to the next level because there's a couple reasons. Number one, we have a lot to say, and we have there are things that our knowledge that we learn from people, past and present, are really relevant for dealing with not only mitigating climate change, but mitigating climate change sustainably. And so that's the topic of my talk today. Can you hear me in the back okay, everyone? Okay, thank you. So without further ado, so this is just a brief outline. I'll briefly introduce the ancestral Maya and focus on seasonal farming and water and power, and talk about the Maya inclusive worldview and how it impacts my ideas. Well, I'm just representing the ideas culled from I've been conducting archaeology in Belize on the ancestral Maya for over 35 years. So I've learned a lot from the ancestral Maya, from the archaeological record, and from the contemporary Maya, who are my foreman and excavation assistants and dear friends and colleagues. So, and in order to do this, to set the stage, we need to understand the Maya area, particularly the southern lowlands, which is this area here on the map here, the southern lowlands. And even though this is a semi-tropical environment, surface water is relatively limited because it's karstic it's a karstic landscape. It's limestone bedrock, so it's very porous. So even though there's a lot of rain, a lot of it percolates through the bedrock. So you have relatively limited surface water, and you have a deep water table, especially in the southern lowlands. The northern lowlands is another story. And there's not one overarching king. There are hundreds of cities and leaders and kings in the southern lowlands, but there are political powerhouses, the well-known Tikal, Calakmul, Naranjo, and Caracol, none of which are located near permanent surface water like lakes or rivers, none. And that has a major bearing on the power of kingship and why kingship failed. And keeping in mind the Maya did all they did, all that you know about the Maya, without beasts of burden, and thus no wheeled carts, no metals geologically in this area. They didn't have extensive irrigation systems because most rivers are entrenched in gullies. And because of all of this, they had labor-intensive projects. I mean, they're still very sophisticated, but it was labor-intensive rather than technological intensive per se. This society is completely rainfall dependent. Everything is, particularly this is significant during the late Classic period between 800 and 600 CE when you have the highest population size, distribution, density, and the most powerful kings, and the most use of the landscape, of the resources, and the implications of that. And another thing they adapted to and dealt with very successfully for millennia was the semi-tropical rainy season. Let me get rid of that. There's a 7-month rainy season where 90% of the rain falls. And it's also the agricultural intensive period. And these are two extremes. So during the height of the rainy season, there's floods, the rivers become full of debris, unnavigable, and this kind of thing. Plus there's the hurricane season, there's tropical storms, there's crop damage, right? And then you have the 5-month dry season. When you're in the jungle, the tropical forest, it's green, but if you don't know where to find water, you can die of dehydration. So you have these two, too much, not enough, the right amount, but when, how it's distributed, and so on. Another thing about this area is that everything is dispersed. Every tropical environment, there's a lot of high biodiversity, but it's dispersed. You don't have clusters of trees of the same species, for example. So this is a soil map regarding agricultural potential, but it also reflects the diversity of flora and fauna. So the black solid one, class 1, is alluvium, which is rare. That's the Belize River that you see this splotch in the lower area here, but that's rare. But the best soils, some of the best tropical soils in the world are these class 2, these dotted areas. And you can see that my research area has a relatively small amount, but this is where we can use it to predict settlement. And before LIDAR, this is the way to do survey, how to select in an area that's never been mapped. This is how I started working in this area in 1997, after several years after I obtained my PhD. And then because of this diversity and the seasonality and the dispersed nature of different kinds of soils and elevations and slope and all these kinds of things, this is reflected in the diverse water and agricultural features from small scale to large scale. So it's hard to say the Maya practiced this kind of agricultural system because there were just so many. They were so in tuned because they've been farming for about 4,000 years, but their ancestors have lived in the area at least by 13,000 years ago. So there's all kinds of things that I'm not going to discuss on, but I just want to emphasize the diversity of everything. And the basis of society, the building blocks of society, the units of action are Maya families, or families, communities, past and present. And that's something, again, that's relevant today. People always look to the government. I look to the Maya. I look to families. It's families that are going to survive us. Because if we don't support the laws, if we don't support all the mitigation, it's sort of moot. It's sort of like if you institute a law that banning gun control. People want guns, they're still going to get guns unless we support it. So it's both top down and bottom up. That's something critical as well. So we have the contemporary Maya, and things are changing very fast due to the impacts of modernization, globalization, and all of that. And so archaeologically, excavating the remnants of these houses that were occupied, these small houses here from Saturday Creek in Belize, which was occupied for over 2,100 years. These houses were occupied for over 1,000 years, and they built up incrementally based on these renewal cycles of ancestors being buried and deanimating, burning and raising everything, and then rebuilding and animating things. Okay, it's all about renewal. So there's stratigraphy. We see stratigraphy layers, but those are cyclical renewal events, right? So it's continual renewal. But my point is too, is that the only reason my families could live in this community and many others like it is because they had a good relationship with the soils, with the water, with the forest. They didn't overuse. And also the rainy, dry season aspect, and I'm talking about the late classic here in particular. In the interior, there are estimates, thanks to LIDAR, of 7 to 11 million people in the interior alone, part of the Patan and Belize and southeastern Mexico and this kind of thing. And during the rainy season, it's the agricultural intensive period, like I mentioned, and it's centrifugal. So people are going out because the soils are dispersed, thus the fields are dispersed, thus the farmsteads are dispersed. All right, and this map shows it, and the Nashtun and the Patan. dispersed soils and farmsteads, and they grew very diverse crops or fields. Multi-cropping. Monocropping is a relatively recent phenomenon. So maize, beans, squash, manioc, cacao, tomatoes, tobacco, pineapple, avocados. These are all cultigens from the Americas. Now the issue is, I mean, you've all seen photos of, ancient Maya cities, right? You've seen beautiful pictures of the exquisite temples and the palaces and the ball courts, yeah? But so why would farmers provide tribute, labor, services, and goods to royals, to kings who lived in the cities? It comes to dry season water needs, okay? Which is also the non-agricultural period during the dry season when water needs. So this is the dry season. Remember, not a lot of permanent surface water, and the surface water that exists during the dry season, 3 months of which it does not rain or drop, things become desiccated. What drew them in were reservoirs, okay? It's just straightforward, nothing fancy. Anything. And this is a LiDAR map highlighting some of the reservoirs, not all in Tikal. But notice they're near the monumental architecture. They're near the palaces. They're near the major temples and the causeways. So the centripetal forces bringing people in to the cities was during the dry season when they needed dry season water. Okay. And this is when they built things. I mean, let's face it, kings and nobility and aristocrats or elites did not build the palaces themselves, did not, renovate things, did not maintain the things. But in exchange for access to water, like I just noted, all the reservoirs are near monumental architecture. So monumental architecture in this sense can be seen as toll booths. You want water, you got to pay. And also, but there are reservoirs, but markets and public ceremonies and ball games. So I argue that Maya political power was somewhat seasonal. So ancient Maya reservoirs have a long history. They started small, incremental, and based on the earliest ones like at Tikal, archaeologists haven't excavated many reservoirs. The ones they found springs. So they started at springs, and so there's still water systems. And the earliest known ones are 400 BCE. And I emphasize that because there might even be earlier ones. And they're basically concave. They take advantage of natural gravity. And as they grow in size and extent and sophistication, they become what we call elevated stream damming reservoirs, or convex. They're built on hilltops, okay, which takes a lot more engineering. Okay, so this pulsating system worked between the seasonal push and pull for over 1,000 years. Okay. Now, why is this relevant for today? Because it has to do with water quality and self-cleaning reservoirs. So, oftentimes Illinois is plagued with the West Nile virus, yes. And so they tell you to make sure you don't have stagnant pools of water because mosquitoes like to breed in there. So the reservoirs are still water. They're just like a pool. Okay, there's no in-streams or out-streams per se, unless to divert water in or to drain away. So with dry season, there's no rain, high temperatures and humidity. And if there's standing water, the potential for it to become stagnant are high. Waterborne diseases, mosquitoes, buildup of nitrogen and phosphorus that promote algal blooms, etc. Okay. Now, I argue in a recent PNAS piece that Maya reservoirs were constructed wetlands, which civil engineers work with today that are used globally at different scales. They're trying to expand their use. That, quote, use natural processes involving wetland vegetation, soils, and their associated microbial assemblages to improve water quality. They're self-cleaning. Remember, they lasted for 5 months. And Tikal and Karakol had 80 to 100,000 people. These reservoirs supplied drinking water as well as bathing, for cooking, to make ceramics, to make plaster. Okay, so not just drinking water. Okay, so this is how constructed wetlands work. And this is, again, how I argue that ancient Maya reservoirs worked, which I am convinced were self-cleaning as well. The aquatic plants, all plants, but aquatic plants uptake nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, those nutrients that actually promote algal growth and decrease, so, and there's a plethora of aquatic biota in Central America. You can go to flora-mesoamerica.org. I mean, the wetland aquatic biota is just incredibly diverse. And also decomposing plants create biofilms that break down nutrients themselves. And zooplankton prey on pathogens, and some bacteria absorb nitrogen and feed on harmful microorganisms such as parasites. So there's not just cleaning water, there's this whole process going on. It's this whole system. It's I call it a symphony. Now, the Maya would have had, based on what constructed wetlands require today, they would have had to dredge bottom debris such as fish feces and decomposing organics, as well as replenish aquatic plants, saturated with nitrogen and phosphorus, which would have been perfect as fertilizer for urban fields, orchards, and gardens. I mean, if you look at maps and if you've seen artist renditions of Maya cities, there's a lot of open areas, not just plazas. More and more sediment soil analysis show, sediment coring shows that there was vegetation and forests and urban gardens. Okay, so they were literally and figuratively green cities. So to maintain the reservoirs nothing is wasted. It was repurposed. It was reused as fertilizer. So I argue. Okay, so Maya cities, as they grew, the layout, I mean, there's some cosmological aspects, but when it comes down to it, they are water management systems. Urban layout equals water management systems. And so, like, for example, here you see causeways. They didn't have, remember, wheeled carts or anything, but they had processions that connected temple complexes and palace complex. But here you can see that they also served as dams, but some of them had pipe-like features, divert water to and from. Plazas are flat and some of them collected water. So every drop of rain was contained, or most of them. And notice the arrows go downhill. So Vern Scarborough and his colleagues argue that downslope Bajo, which are seasonal wetlands, and the guadras, which are natural sinkholes lined with clay that become desiccated over the dry season. So downslope is gray water, basically, that could be used for to water gardens and fields, for fish ponds, construction projects, and to attract game and waterfowl. I mean, animals need water too. So the question is, how did the Maya know that water was clean? Excuse me while I take a sip of this vital source. Based on the presence of Nymphaea ampla, water lilies. Okay, I have to tell you a story about when I had a postdoc at Berkeley before I started my first job at New Mexico State University. And I spoke with several civil engineers, and they had a library solely devoted to water. And one of the things I'm like, oh my gosh, there must be so much on water lilies because they must be part of this uptake. All plants uptake all these nutrients, but they're actually very sensitive. They can only grow in water that's still, not too deep, slightly alkaline, can't have too much limestone, can't have too much algae. In other words, they only grow in clean water, i.e. drinkable water. And they also have hallucinogenic properties, which may have been involved for the rulers, the kings and the priests and that kind of thing. And also the lily pads, as you can see here, restrict light and inhibit evaporation and keep the water cool. Okay, so again, there's never just one purpose for everything. Everything is complicated, everything is connected. Water lilies also symbolized kingship. So the general term for kings are water lily lords. And so kings were water managers. They performed the necessary ceremonies to Chak, the capricious rain god, and to ancestors and other ceremonies. They organized the maintenance of these reservoirs. It was the major foundation of their power. As long as there are rains, it's fine, yes? As long as the foundation of their power was fine. But kings did not diversify their financial portfolio. You have to diversify, so we're told. You can imagine what happens. There is an urban diaspora by 900 CE in the southern lowlands, where the majority of cities, or all of the cities in the southern lowlands, 99%, Maya left them. there's not a lot of evidence for violence. A few cities show, out of the hundreds, show some violence, but people just vote it with their feet. Scholars estimate that 90% of the Maya immigrated out of the interior, going to permanent lakes, going to the coastal areas. And this is when we see a rise in maritime trade. We see a fluorescence in the northern lowlands, like at Chichen Itza and Uxmal and other cities in the northern lowlands, and Ucanal and further west. And you just see they go in all directions. Okay? So Maya didn't disappear. Kings did, but not families. And oxygen isotope analysis of a stalagmite show that there were at least 8 3 to 18-year-long droughts between 800 900 CE, or called the terminal classic. It set in motion events because every city had their own history. Some did show evidence for deforestation. Some did show evidence for erosion, and some were thriving. But if you don't have enough rain to replenish the reservoir waters, and that's the foundation of your power and why people came, or one of the major reasons, so it set in motion events. And so people left cities and kings by 900. So kings disappeared for good in the southern Maya lowlands. Families persevered. Kings were path dependent, like we are in fossil fuels today. Okay. Maya families immigrated to areas with lakes and rivers, and they adapted, and they still do. There's over 7 million Maya living today in the Central America and throughout the globe. And it speaks to their sustainable way of life as farming families for 4,000 years. How? A worldview that guided their daily existence and engagement with a non-human world. And I have permission to use this photo as well as their real name. This is on the far right is Cleofo Chok, a Mopan Maya and one of my foremen. And we've been working together since 1998. Okay, the Maya inclusive worldview is non-anthropocentric. It is the exact opposite of our current worldview, which is very anthropocentric. Okay. Oops, what'd I do? Okay. I'm a Mac person. Okay. So in this worldview, and this is, you can take a picture of the QR code for the article, where the Maya see or saw traditionally humans on the same plane as objects, animals, land, water, etc. I'm not saying they're necessarily equal. I'm just saying on the same plane because they acknowledge that each played a major role in maintaining the world. And they acknowledge non-humans as kin. And this is many indigenous worldviews think this, okay, traditionally before things have changed. And so everything is animated and has a soul. And circular. Death begets life through renewal. Souls are recycled. A shoal is newborn, but also means replacement. Not corporal, but the souls. Everything has a soul, And there aren't any Cartesian dichotomies. No nature, culture. No sacred and profane. Everything is merged. So when I wrote this article, it was really hard to find the English vocabulary that expressed this. Okay, so in Mesoamerican languages in general, and there are 30 Mayan languages, existing ones today, there are no terms for nature or religion. I mean, because everyone was part of the same world. Yes, they had to hunt. Yes, they had to cut down things. Yes, no one was perfect. Also, their languages are ergative. There's a plurality of subjects. There's an emphasis on we, a de-emphasis on I. And we includes clouds, plants, rivers, mountains, animals, etc., i.e. the other inhabitants who help maintain the world. They coexisted with non-humans. No one overtaxed each other. The Maya did not cause the extinction of any plants or animals. And since 1500, or is it 1700, we've been responsible for the extinction of 72 genera. And there's an article that was released yesterday about the extinction of birds that keep increasing. Okay, so this was based on reciprocal relations that required acknowledgement via ceremonies and other types of engagement and collaboration. So just as an example, I want to get away from using terms like forest management and talk about forest collaboration. Okay, so one kind of forest collaboration is more direct. And so what Cleofo assisted one of my former grad students, Colleen Lindsay, and her co-advisor was a botanist, and they collected plots, 40-meter diameter plots in various areas with sites in a city, small sites, in areas without sites. They collected all the vegetation, and I love this photo. Not only does it highlight Colleen and Cleofo, but just the different kinds of vegetation. It's all green because you have it at all levels. Okay. And they identified in these various 40-meter plots over 300 different species. Cleofo was able to identify 95% of them. In Mopon, he also speaks Quechua and English and Spanish and Creole. So, and he had everyone he knew the use of, or the most of them. And I just asked him, I'm like, so Cleofo, what about those 5% you didn't identify? What is it about them that, he said, they have no use? So, because people argue, previous scholars have argued that there's no such thing as, if there are humans nearby, there's no such thing as a primary forest, that they're all descendant forests because of thousands of years of humans interacting and other species as well, especially the large game, you know, that leave lots of doo-doo with seeds kind of thing. Yeah, so it's very, you know, so the distribution of current forests is a descendant forest reflecting, you know, millennia of this collaboration, millennia. Okay, same thing with this healthy and biodiverse forest. Even during the late classic, Rachel Taylor, who obtained her PhD in this past April, she looked at faunal remains, animal bones, from the pre-classic, from about, I think our oldest ones were 400 BCE up through post-classic, about 1100. And basically the diversity of faunal remains doesn't change. And animals in the tropics require the forest to breed and to nurture. So if you find certain species, you know there was a forest, and plus sediment cores and all this kind of thing. So even during the height of population land use and stuff, we see this biodiverse forest and healthy forests nearby, like Saturday Creek. When I said those two commoner houses, those two farmsteads were occupied for, you know, 1,000 years at least. They had to have this not only collaboration, but a relational collaboration. And the Chok home garden, and again, we have permission, and Colleen mapped this, and the numbers represent different species, and some are non-domesticated, some are domesticated, some are non-native, and some are native. So the numbers represent, and there's foods, medicine, household items, poison, for example, to stun fish, construction materials, flowers for ornaments, and others. You know, here's some bird peppers, mint, and that stump in front here is used to churn butter. You know, everything has multi-uses, purpose. Okay, so it mimics the diverse forest, as do the milpas, the fields. Okay, again, monocropping, right? So every bush you see here and tree serves a purpose. So they have their gardens, their home gardens, then they have their fields, then they have their forests. There's that level of diversity as well. Another type of collaboration is more indirect. Collaboration via portals to the underworld or openings in the earth. And home to Chak, the rain god, and ancestors, and where people communicate with ancestors and gods. And it's also viewed as origins of clouds and rain. This is Aktun Tunutio Muknal in Belize, and that's depicting Chak. And in, you know, because it's karstic topography, you're going to find thousands of caves because of the porosity. You have dry caves and you have wet caves, and you have lots of kinds of different offerings. I won't show the human remains, and some are ancestors, and that's another story. But some of the things you see on the floor here are modern, of course, archaeology tools, but many are broken vessels or jars with evidence of food, or some likely were water. Some are overturned. These are all purposefully placed. Some have been moved by water, but there's actually a story in how things are placed. Okay. I'm exploring Cara Blanca, which is a different kind of portal to the underworld. It's a watery one. So this is a map. And here, it's a different pattern, but this darker hatch area, those are the class 2, some of the best tropical soils for agriculture in the world. So these blue dots, these are individual sites. It could be a small mound or a small community. And this is done by former PhD student Andrew Kinkella. Now, these numbers here are water bodies. There's 25 water bodies, pools, 25 pools. Some are lakes and some are cenotes, which are collapsed sinkholes fed by groundwater. So the blue dots cluster near lakes, farmsteads, communities. The blue dots near the cenotes in the center here, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 15, 14. The blue dots are all ceremonial architecture. So based on my excavations, our excavations here, I argue that the area with cenotes are pilgrimage destinations, and they leave a minimal footprint, which allow flora and fauna to flourish and fosters biodiversity and conservation. And just like many religious areas, and pilgrimage places around the world, you can't hunt there, you can't collect things, you can't do certain kinds of things. It's a protected area. Okay. So I argue that these in similar areas, and this is a cenote Pool 20. I know it's a very exciting name. It's 100 meters diameter and 40 meters deep. We focused our efforts, however, at Pool 1. And that star there, that's the lookout. I'll refer back to that in a few slides. Cara Blanca's white face because of the white limestone exposed here. And we find water lilies, Nymphaea ampla, on the edges. So, and Dr. Patricia Beddoes, who's a hydrochemist at Northwestern, came down and she used a hydrolab and to determine the quality of the water and found that it's very clean water, high mineral content. Okay. And a lot's happened since, unfortunately, and I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so we focused on Pool 1, and Pool 1, is 100 meters across by 70 meters. But this one is over 230 feet deep. And you can see the blue, and it's against the cliff face. There's 2 geological formations, and Pool 1. And they also found, the divers found, relocated, I think the Maya knew about this, an underwater cave. And that's another story, the time issue. Offerings, because it's so deep and it's at the base of a cliff, and so trees have been falling in for thousands of years. So it's very dangerous and it covers a lot. So after the funding ended for the diving expeditions, I don't dive. I have some of the top cave exploration divers do this. We found a step that's very small, that's a meter away from the edge. So now we know where they made offerings. So again, I'll have to do that in the near future. That's the plan. And we also found fossil beds, megafauna. There's just hundreds and hundreds. And we extracted, in 2014, Dr. Greg McDonald came down. He's a paleontologist diver, and he collected giant sloth bones. And in the Larman et al. Piece, they dated a giant sloth tooth to 27,000 years ago. And they did all this analysis with Stan Ambrose in his isotope lab at University of Illinois. And they found that it was more savanna, 9-month dry season instead of 5. You can read the article. I don't have a QR code because I had to choose between an image of a giant sloth or the QR code. So, but you can email me if you like. So that's something we need to explore as well. Also, Brendan Buckley from Lamont Tree Ring Library at Columbia came down as well. And he's a dendroclimatologist, and he took samples of some of the trees. And one dated to 9,000 years ago. So again, we can put together the history. It's a question of time, and there's a lot of stuff going on. So, but we did excavate a temple that's literally on the edge, and looters unfortunately weakened it, and some of it has collapsed into the pool. But the water temple, they intensified their visits and building strategies between 800 and 900. They spent a lot of labor to do so. They intensified their visit. We only mostly found water jars. We didn't find household stuff. It was all big ceremonial vessels. Okay, this kind of thing. So they came here. Now, despite those massive droughts between 800 and 900, they did not build houses. They did not farm here. They did not build cities. They could have, even during the dry season when I go, the water levels barely drop. And even if they had 230 feet, it might drop a little, but there would have been plenty of water, but they did not intrude in this landscape. That's the power of place. They could have, but not only was there urban diaspora, again, there was a diaspora out of the interior. And there's other ceremonial architecture nearby at cenotes. So this inclusive worldview is in contrast to the anthropocentric worldview, but by working or collaborating with nature, it's resulted in a millennia of sustainable living versus the anthropocentric worldview, which has resulted in attempts to control or tame nature for short-term gains, resulting in the Anthropocene and climate change and all this kind of stuff. So, and just to give you an example of how this is expressed currently. So this is going back to that yellow star on the earlier map. I'm looking south from the cliff face, looking south. So there was a massive hurricane in 2010, and then there was a massive fire during the dry season with all the dead trees. And so the sustainable logging company that owned it sold 30,000 acres to a agribusiness, basically. And this is what it looks like today. And so I have a 3-year NSF to do salvage archaeology, but it's been really difficult working with these landowners. All the white splotches you see here are ancient Maya structures, houses, community centers, farmsteads. So every year they plow 50. Every time they plow, we lose 50 years because they rebuild, and commoners rebuild in small increments about every 20 years or so. It has to do with renewal and calendrical stuff. And also when you need to replace the thatch roof. So there's all this stuff going on. So, and then COVID hit, so prevented from going, so more plowing. So it's been interesting. I have 1 more year left. But evidence also shows that the ancestral Maya fed maybe twice as many people in the past without the massive deforestation we see presently, using mechanized techniques, monocropping, clear cutting, chemical, pesticides, herbicides, and their land abuts the Cara Blanca pools. So I am concerned with all the chemicals polluting Cara Blanca and everything. I mean, the devastation is very difficult. So the Maya, past and present, have taught me a lot, and that they're relevant practices for mitigating climate change. I'm going to discuss a few. It starts in the home. You can't blame the government for everything. It has to start at the home, and it's going to be challenging. We have to diversify everything. It's really strange that people focus on monocropping when we take multivitamins, we, again, diversify a financial portfolio. You don't just exercise one arm. You work on the whole body. You diversify everything. Your food. Okay, maybe I don't. Okay. So I'm not naive. We can't get back the inclusive worldview, but we can be more aware of what's going on around us. And one of the main things about taking into account the inclusive worldview is, not only the connectivity, but strategies have to include non-humans. So all of the, sustainability, sustainable ideas and climate change are only considering humans. And let's face it, we need the Earth's resources to survive. If we don't take care of our fellow entities, and it's moot. We can, we'll save humankind, but we will not be able to survive. We need the resources of the Earth. The Earth doesn't need us. Okay. So strategies have to consider non-humans, not just to be, politically correct or whatever. It's moot if we don't have clean air. Yeah, let's save humans, but we don't have clean water. We don't have clean air. Everything's polluted. So, and the healthy and biodiverse forests collaborate with resources. I have them in quotes because I call them entities rather than resources. That's an imposed, direct long occupation histories, like I said, Otter Creek, and indirect pilgrimage, sacred, or that kind of thing. Gene banks, they're gene banks. Right now we put genes in a bank. Let's actually just create natural gene banks. nature reserves, parks, reforest. Trees produce oxygen, capture CO2, curtail wind and water erosion. They're major role in hydrological cycle, evapotranspiration. They support flora and fauna. Trees matter. Also, there's over 10 million swimming pools in the United States alone. I'm not saying this has to be voluntary. Voluntary. Now, there's already companies who make natural pools. Excuse me, I'm just looking at the time. There are companies who make natural pools. So why not turn your pools into self-cleaning constructed wetlands? You have clean water plus edible medicinal flora, reeds, basketry, bamboo, fish, eels, turtles, crab, shrimp, mollusks, snails swim. You can swim too. I mean, there'd have to be a balance, because probably humans would pollute, right, with all the chemicals. And then again, they'd have to be maintained and provide natural fertilizer. And regarding agriculture and subsistence, mimic ecosystem biodiversity, diverse agricultural practices, multi-cropping, diverse forest foods, materials, medicine. So let's, in the book, I say the Maya see the forest as a pharmacy, as a drugstore, as a grocery store, as a general store. If we do that too, then we can have a beautiful forest that we can collaborate with. So it's just not saving the trees. It's saving ourselves and collaborating more with them and what they bring with them. Medicinal stuff as well. And, gardens and yards, empty lots everywhere. Let's greenify everything. Green cities. I mean, many Maya cities were occupied for over 2,000 years. And they have constructed wetlands, fields, orchards, fish ponds, gardens, forested areas, residences, roadways, and so on. I mean, I know Chicago's up on that, but a lot of the things are based on technology, like solar power and electronic vehicles, great. But what do they? Batteries are based on minerals that are finite. So what about I'm not an inventor. Photosynthesis, true renewable green energy. Right now, all the green energy is not renewable. Solar panels. Everything is based on finite materials. And then how you extract that, mining, the destruction it causes to everybody. And everybody is including non-humans. So, the Maya, because they didn't have beasts of burden, and they had to carry everything in human bearers, they could do some canoeing, but because of the water issue, they relied on local resources and networks. So the urban-rural ties are key. And that's something that needs to be better emphasized, versus going to Amazon for everything. And yes, I'm guilty. I'm trying to cut back. And there are other relevant practices that I discuss in my book that Stacy mentioned that's coming out in January, My Wisdom and the Survival of Our Planet, Transformation via Rituals, Agriculture and Subsistence, in addition to stuff I talked about regarding hunting, fishing, meat, consumption, pets, zoos, technology and labor ratios, multifunctional infrastructure and reuse, repurposing organic waste in the dead. Remember, only souls are recycled. And migration. With that, thank you.
If you have questions, we'll give a mic to you just so that we can hear you in the recording.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was absolutely fascinating, and I have 1,000 questions, but I'll just ask one. I'm a Midwestern archaeologist and very interested in sort of the later Mississippian period when we have those intense droughts, then everybody leaves. So it's a little bit, it's much later and a little different. But I'll ask a question about leadership. And because I really found it fascinating, your discussion of the control of water being sort of the source of power for leaders. And so it's a two-part question. One, those settlements that are adjacent to the cenotes, were they occupied by emissaries of, the leaders? like, did they have control of those cenotes, or is that a later period? And then secondly, do those dry periods, the seasonal power that you were talking about during the dry periods where people probably would have come in and paid tribute for water to the leaders, did those periods coincide with any sort of marked calendrical celebrations that might take place, like astronomical events or anything like that? Anyway, just thinking about, what might have been prioritized in terms of calendrical events and power seasonally.
Thank you for those. Well, the first question regarding cenotes, at Carablanca, they did not build permanent settlement near cenotes, only ceremonial structures. Near the lakes, there were permanent settlement. And they were more dispersed community. And they probably didn't need to, they might have gone to the nearby Center Bielbach for ceremonies, but there's plentiful water. But the lakes do drop and they become more murky and disease ridden, but the cenotes don't. But they never built near the cenotes at Carablanca. That's the issue, is like they could have, they didn't. Regarding the leadership aspect, I work with Tim Pacatot, so I'm familiar with the Cahokia a bit regarding the leadership. Oh, what was your question? I forgot.
Are these dry periods sort of timed?
Oh, right.
Types of events that are celebrated?
Well, everything's seasonal. I mean, the Maya are known for their exquisite hieroglyphic system, right? But the reason that the study of the ancestral Maya are not in history departments is because the written record just focuses on royal life, when they were born, when they acceded to the throne, which rituals they performed, if they captured somebody, and this kind of thing. They didn't talk about anything else. So that's where archaeology comes in. So Maya farmers, they just read the sun. They just read the seasons. But during the solstice would have happened during the summer, during this time. Well, borderline, that's the beginning actually of the rainy season. June 21st is like the perfect. So that would have been great. There would have been mostly rain and ancestors and other kinds of seasonal gods, fertility, this kind of thing. But yes, there were so many kinds of ceremonies, so many things that, the chapter in one of my books is called Chak, the capricious rain god, because, too much, not enough, when, how, that kind of thing. So it was always required appeasement. But there's a lot of other major gods and major elements and ancestors, not just royal ones, but everyone. And then renewal and just relations also then with the forest, with the water. So there was a lot of things to do. It's a question of what the royals did. And people still always conducted the same rites in the home. So you had different scalar things, but it was all about this engagement. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much for your talk. I think it was wonderful to hear not only about ancient Maya, but also our irresponsibilities. My question is concerning the kinship. You mentioned kinship with the non-human. So could you explain a little bit more of what and who becomes this non-human kin? How is the kinning process made? And is there a kin term that distinguishes between human kin and non-human kin? And can kinship be seasonal? And the very last question is, you mentioned the repurposing the dead. If you could just speak a little bit more about that. I'm sorry, too many questions.
I'm
Thanks.
not a linguistic anthropologist, but so I'm horrible at remembering details kind of thing. But the kinship, it's just basically, for example, a house doesn't become a home until it's animated. Once they get permission from the earth gods to use the mud and material, wood and whatever else to create the house, it's not a home until they perform animation ceremonies to animate it. So it's just another living entity. So kinfolk is even too general. It's just one of us. I mean, it's another animated soul, because according to ethnographers, different species, different things, non-humans and humans, communicate through their souls, not through corporal things. So it's sort of, kin doesn't even cover it, if that again, it's hard to find the correct terminology. And I'm not just saying that to get out of answering the question in more detailed matter, but did that make sense though? So everything's animated. So we've lost that. We didn't think I don't know if this is wood or not, So it's still a podium, but it's not animated because probably no one's performed animated. No. burning incense and copal or something like this, and saying certain prayers that now incorporate Christian entities. Not all, it just varies kind of thing. There's a lot of impact. Repurposing the dead based on epigraphy, radiocarbon, and all of this. Arlen Diane Chase posit that only 10% of Maya are buried in house floors, tombs, shrines, etc., and caves. 90% probably back to the forest. Forest of souls, family forest, literally. And so one of the things I argued is for natural reburials. Caskets aren't required by law in the United States. All the metals, all the wood, wasted. Okay. I think. So okay, so for example, those two small houses I showed, the excavations, so many's been plowed off. So they definitely occupied between 400 and 1150, so 800 years, but I know at least. But basically I estimate that, conservatively, 5 people living there at the same time, new generation every 20 years. And if they buried all the people there, 188 burials per house. No way. Or something like that. There's just, I found 12 in both. That's still a lot. And they're both 6 by 5 meters, más o menos. So there's still a lot of, ancestors there, but every archaeological site is like that. There's no way all the burials represent that density, the population. And and caves, there's no cemeteries. Neither are there latrines. Another way to repurpose waste, organic kind of thing. So yeah, and again, it's not just the ancestral Maya and traditional Maya, it's a lot of indigenous knowledge throughout the world that we can learn so much from. And yes, we can't be naive, but there's still a lot there. So there's 2 aspects to that. Number one, most strategies, especially top down, are only for humans only. Number 2, oh shoot, what was I going to do? Number 2. All right. Right now, sustainability and climate change is sort of separate. What is sustainable now with climate change may not be sustainable in 10 years. So they have to be spoken of, discussed together. Yes.
I want to, just really quickly too, to finish off, one of Sabrina's questions that I thought was really interesting is kinship seasonal?
I don't think so. Everything's animated from ceramic vessels. You need permission to use the clays, tempers, water, fire, wood to fire it. And you make prayers and then you create a vessel. And there are, I have a few poems. I don't remember if I used the one, but it's about the pot talking back. You're going to burn me, then I'm going to burn you, burn your hand, kind of thing. So yeah, there's and there's one I can't remember now if I do include it. It's about how they're boiling something in a vessel for drinking. Oh shoot. Anyway, they're merging the vessel in the liquid. So they're interacting with each other. It doesn't have to include humans. It's the souls that interact. So again, it's beyond kinship. So I don't think it's seasonal. There's different seasonal relations, if you will, focus kinds of things, but it's always there. It never ends just because you don't see it.
Thank you for the talk. I really appreciated learning more about the role of, or the interaction between water and governance. And I work with students here at the museum and we go look at the artwork and the ceramics up in the hall. So I'm wondering, can we see that interaction between water and the role of water in the governance in the ceramics? Are there any things you could tell the kids to look for when they're looking at artwork? Or is it mostly something that you've learned through excavating monumental architecture, looking at things that are still physically there in the terrain?
There's a lot of iconography that has to do with water and aspects of, it might not be obvious, and the iconography of water, there was an exhibit on just water iconography about 15 years ago, and Houston and Finnemore have an edited volume, and there's chapters are written by specialists, but it's focusing on, it's a very visual book and color fiery pool. And but it's different aspects of water. So there's 3D, there's sculptures of crocodiles, and not just water lilies, but other aquatic life. And there's an unnamed god, because they can't find the name. Epigraphers can't. It's a jaguar, which is the most powerful animal there, carnivore, and associated with kingship, but just powerful carnivore jaguar. And it has a water lily tied around its head, like almost like a tie, a bow, but the water lilies on top. It's just called water lily god because, you know, and I mean, that's like, again, this merged existence kind of thing. And every person has a animal companion spirit. It's never domesticated animal. It's always wild in the forest, again, and it's taken care of by ancestors. If you do something wrong, you're a Y, W-A-Y, pronounced Y, becomes ill, you become ill. You know, so if you know, because again, no one's perfect, but you will pay, and so will your community. And I have a section on witchcraft persecution regarding that as well. Behavior, correct behavior. I mean, humans are human. Yay. Yes, so there's actually a lot on iconography and water, Maya. Yeah, and flowers aquatic. Yeah, a fish, mosquitoes, you know, and especially in the vessels. And if you go to Kerr, Kerr, or mayavase.com, he does the rollout. He started the rollout of the cylindrical vessels, and you can put in water and they'll all come up, kind of thing. And I'm not sure, I've seen some of the collections here, of course, the San Jose stuff is from Belize. And I've seen it on exhibit, and I've seen the exhibit collections eons ago. But yeah, so there's a lot, but I'm not sure about here. I can't remember, to be honest. Did I answer your question?
Other questions? We have, I guess I wanted to ask one.
Sure.
So there is this very simplified, you've alluded to it throughout your talk, this very simplified explanation of that movement north due to drought and starvation and deforestation. And that is, you know, very centered on Maya irresponsibility, right? They cut down all the trees, they burned all the lime. I was just wondering if you know, wanted to take a shot at that, or, you know,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, well, it would, I mean, I think some people use the excuse, well, they destroyed it. So, I mean, you know, but again, with increasing sediment core analyses and pollen analysis and paleobotany, basically is that shows that even around the reservoirs in the major reservoirs that have been excavated are like Tikal and a few other cities in the Patan, and they show that there's trees surrounding the reservoirs. So everything that was open probably was forested. And when you see artist rendition, everything is open and covered in plaster. Have you been in the jungle without any cover? It's not pleasant. I mean, I'm sure the plazas were open for, you know, thousands of people to congregate and to perform in ceremonies to witness. But everything else, I'm sure it was covered in gardens and flowers and trees, and again, vegetation surrounded the reservoirs. So, and then also the LiDAR, people, you know, yes, there's definitely a lot of Maya, way more than living in the past. But again, animal bones speak to the existence of forests, the collaboration, the maintenance, kind of thing. So the LiDAR strips away vegetation so you can see the architecture, but I think some people read it too literally. It would have been stripped away. There would have been a lot more forested landscape, kind of thing. Again, and that's indicated in the archaeological record. And, you know, also fish remains and bird remains and reptile remains and aquatic remains. And, you know, so, I mean, every city has its own history. And again, some did have issues with erosion, but in general, no. 4,000 years without massive deforestation, like the extent we see today. And yes, people, you know, simplify things or say the Maya disappeared. Kings disappeared in the Southern Lowlands, that's all. I mean, they didn't even die off. I mean, most of them just became elite as their forebears had been. I think. And then in the post-classic rulership was shared rulership. It was hierarchical. So I call it like in the dry season, it was hierarchical structured. In the rainy season, in the communities, it's hierarchical or self-organized. They weren't under the thumb, they didn't need water. Saturday Creek, which I've mentioned, it's on the Belize River. And it's over an aquifer because that's where I stay at Banana Bank Lodge. It's on, and their waters, we still rely on the aquifer, even though it's right on the Belize River, and they have 80 horses or 100 horses, and they have a farm, and it's a ranch. I mean, it's all relies on the aquifer. They had that. No kings. They had temples. They had smaller temples, smaller elite structures. They had a small ball cart, smaller plazas. No evidence for kingship though, because kings couldn't provide anything they couldn't provide themselves. Water, plentiful alluvium, aquifer. So there are cities without kings because there was no means for them to acquire power over others. I mean, if you had a chance not to pay taxes and survive on your own, I'm sure you'd take it. Legally, of course. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.